Okay, hello. Welcome back to the Rhetoric of Story. Thank you very much for joining me for our second lecture, which is on, and I know you're eager to know this, which is on the idea of change. This is our first part of the Rhetoric of Story. If you remember, in our first lecture, we talked about the idea of how we can best understand story so that as writers, as creators, we can tell stories effectively. Sometimes we make storytelling very complex. The techniques of storytelling, particularly in the modern age, if we're making films, producing novels, making video games, they're rather complicated and they're driven by technology. But we thought about, in the first lecture, how actually all of these technologies simply allow us to tell stories in much the same way as we always have been. We considered some of the history of storytelling, going back through playwrights like Shakespeare, all the way to classical Greek theatre, and even further back to the roots of oral storytelling, epic poetry, and going right back in the history of stories all the way through the last 5,000 years and further. And we did this for a very specific idea. We were trying to think about what's constant and continuous through this history of storytelling. And what that gives us is the rhetoric of story. We had to think about the art of persuasion and persuasive communication as defined by Aristotle, which is the idea of rhetoric itself, and the ideas of ethos, pathos, and logos that are the basic elements of rhetoric, of speech giving, and we also employ them in writing today, and how we persuade an audience by imitating the way that we as humans make decisions. And that's what's really pivotal in the idea of rhetoric, that it reflects back to us how we think, how our brains work, and how our minds operate. And this leads us to the idea of the rhetoric of story. But the reason why storytelling is so effective is because when we tell a story in a powerful way, it reflects back to us how we think, how our minds work and how our brains work, and how they make sense of the world around them. And this is the rhetoric of story, that when we employ these 7 basic elements of storytelling, we lead the reader, the audience, into an imaginative world, which is the world of the story itself. But the way that we do this is really quite simple. And today we're going to be thinking about the first one of the basic elements, the first part of the rhetoric of storytelling, which is the idea of change. There was a young man, you know this young man, you'll recognize him as soon as I tell you his name. There was a young man called Jack. And what's important to know about Jack is that Jack enjoyed spending his time sitting around in the living room on the sofa, possibly playing Xbox, watching the television, maybe doing all the other kinds of things that lazy young men do. Jack hated the idea of tidying up the house, doing work. He didn't have a job. He just stayed at home. One day, his mother was simply sick of this. So Jack's mother barged into the living room and said, "Jack, I've had enough of your laziness. Take the cow, our one and only valuable possession. I want you to take it to the market and sell it. Because if we don't sell the cow for money, we won't have any food and we're going to starve." And Jack said, all right then, I'll take the cow, whatever. So Jack left the house, he took the cow, he went down the road, but Jack he really wasn't in the mood for any of this. So when a crazy old man came wandering down the street, he just had a bag of beans in his hand, but he came down the lane and he said to Jack, "I have the most amazing beans in the world. Nobody else has my beans. They're absolutely fantastic. And Jack thought to himself, well, I'm a smart boy. So he offered to swap the cow for the beans. And the old man said, I don't know. Oh, all right then, yes. So he handed over the beans, and the old man went off with the cow, which was the only valuable possession of Jack and his mother. And Jack headed home with the beans, and he thought he was the bee's knees. And he went, Mum, I've got these beans for the cow. And his mum held beans in her hand, and she was disgusted, and she was terrified because Jack had given away their only valuable possession. And she screamed and she said, Jack, no, how could you do this? And she threw the beans out of the window and she began to cry. And when she began crying, Jack felt terrible because he wasn't being told what to do anymore. In fact, his mother had no more suggestions. He could see that his mother was terrified and upset and that he was the cause of all of this. And Jack went to bed feeling sick in his stomach. The next morning, Jack awoke and he saw outside his window a beanstalk, an enormous, massive, giant beanstalk, curling up from the ground all the way into the sky and reaching up through the clouds. And Jack thought, I wonder where that goes. I enjoy climbing. I'll just climb up it a little bit. So Jack climbed up to the first bean sprout coming out of the stalk, and he thought, well, I can make it further than this. I'll carry on. And he went up all the way to the clouds, and he went through the clouds. And from above the clouds, Jack could see a mansion. And Jack thought, well, I've climbed all the way up the beanstalk. I'm just going to go and see what this mansion is about. So Jack crept up to the mansion, and it was enormous. Even the first floor was 10 times taller than the shack where Jack and his mother lived. It was so huge, in fact, that Jack could creep under the door. And so he did. And Jack crept under the door, and he crept around in the mansion until he heard a booming voice which declared, Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. And Jack was terrified of this voice, and he ran for his life. But on the way, Jack saw a sack of gold coins, and he grabbed them, and he ran out of the building, and he ran back down the beanstalk, and he said to his mother, Mother, look what I've got. I've got a sack of gold coins. And Jack's mother was ecstatically happy and relieved because now they had money and they could eat. And the next day came, and Jack thought, well, if I got a sack of gold coins last time, I wonder what I'll get from the giant's house this time. So Jack climbed up the beanstalk all the way to the clouds, and he ran along to the clouds, and he crept under the door of the mansion, and he crept through the mansion until he heard once again, Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. And this time Jack ran from his life, but he found a goose. And he grabbed the goose and he tucked it under his arm, and he ran all the way back down, and he gave the goose to his mother. And his mother was twice as happy as she'd even been with the gold coins, because now they had a goose that could lay eggs, and he could feed them every day. And for the next 7 days, for the whole week, Jack repeated this. He crept up the beanstalk and he crept back down again, every time hearing the same giant bellow, fee, fi, fo, fum. And on the 7th day, Jack heard another voice. He heard the voice of a young woman, and she was crying. And Jack crept through the mansion, and he found the bedroom of the giant's daughter. And he said to the giant's daughter, Why are you crying? And the giant's daughter said, Because I'm never allowed to leave the giant's mansion. He has me trapped here, my father does. And Jack said, Right, we're getting out of here. So Jack took the giant's daughter, and hand in hand they ran back through the mansion, they ran across the clouds, and they began to climb down the beanstalk. But the giant had had enough of this. He'd lost his sack of gold coins, he'd lost his goose, he'd lost his harp, he'd lost his magic light, he'd lost everything else that Jack had stolen over the last 7 days, and now he'd lost his daughter. He was going to find out who this thief was and where he came from. So the Jack stormed out of his mansion and he ran across the clouds and he began to climb down the beanstalk. And it was a race between Jack and the giant. And Jack was climbing down the beanstalk, carrying the giant's daughter on his back. And he made it to the bottom and he could see the giant coming. So Jack ran back into the house and he picked up the axe that he had used to catch firewood for the whole of his life. And he took the axe and he ran to the beanstalk and he hacked at it and he hacked at it and he hacked at it again until the beanstalk toppled over, taking the giant with it, and the giant crashed into the ground. And after all his adventures, Jack was now free. He had the belongings of the giant, he had the giant's daughter, and he and the giant's daughter wed and were happy. And Jack had gone from a lazy young boy to a grown man with all the things that a grown man should have: money and a family and a wife. And he was able to take on the world, which is the quality that a grown man should always be able to embody. And this is why Jack and the Beanstalk is such a powerful story. We've been calling Jack for about 250 years. There's a whole series of Jack stories, and Jack is usually either an Englishman or a Cornishman. And these were traditional English folk tales. And Jack and the Beanstalk is the most famous of them, and it's the one that's come down to us through the ages. But we think that the story of a young boy who robs from a giant or from an ogre is over 5,000 years old. And folklorists have categorized it under the Arne Thompson UFA categorization of folk and fairy tales. It is number 328, The Treasures of the Giant. And why is it that this story has come down to us through so much time, not just 3 centuries, but 5 millennium of time, spoken from mouth to mouth, maybe even thousands of years before? That was just the first written record of it that we can trace back to. And it's because of the key change that the story tells us about, which is the story of a boy becoming a man. And across every culture on the planet, across all the things that divide us and that we see as different, there are archetypal transitions that we make in life, archetypal changes. And when we talk about these changes in stories, they become really tremendously compelling and powerful. And this is the first part of the rhetoric of storytelling, the idea of change. There's an old saying, usually attributed to the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Heraclitus, that no man ever steps in the same river twice. The water that's running down the path of the river is always moving, it's always changing, it's always different water. So when we take our bare foot and step into it, we're always stepping into something essentially different than we were before. And of course, Heraclitus isn't just talking about the river, and he's not just talking about water. He's talking about life and the entire world around us, because everything is continuously changing. From tiny subatomic particles that are zooming around on quantum probabilistic paths to the planet, which is turning and spinning around the sun, which is in turn moving as part of the galaxy. And in fact, nothing is ever the same. And people are never the same either. Our mind, our brain, has evolved, has developed to be constantly tracking and trying to make sense of change. So we get up in the morning and it's daytime. And as the day progresses, the sun goes flying across the sky and it becomes nighttime. And our brain is trying to make sense of why the light has changed around us. The people that we know and ourselves. The days pass and the weeks pass and the months pass, and we age over time. We're changing continuously. We're born into a world where there's maybe a right-wing government And then a few years later, there's a left-wing government. And again, the world has changed around us. And we're constantly trying to make sense of all this change. How do we do that? We tell stories. Stories are the way that we have of giving meaning to change. And that turns very important, meaning and how we make sense of the changes that go on around us. So when we come to creating stories of our own, the idea of change is arguably the most important element of storytelling, but also the most overlooked and forgotten because it's so fundamental and it permeates stories down so very far. Thinking about Jack and the Beanstalk, we saw how the basic change in the story for all the tellings of it over 5,000 years has remained the same. It's about the transition of going from a boy to a man. And so many of the really great stories are about these basic archetypal life transitions that we make. And they help us not just to understand them, but they often define what these transitions are. We understand what it is to become a man from being a boy because of the many stories that we grow up with. They tell us how we should do this. Sometimes they give us bad ideas about it, and sometimes very good ideas. And this is true of some of the most famous stories around us today. Let's have a think about a few examples. Pride and Prejudice. So there's a young woman, Elizabeth Bennet. She's part of a family with many daughters. And she's faced with the challenge of getting married, which at the time that Jane Austen was talking about was the most important change in the lives of most women. And she's faced with a number of possible suitors, one of whom is the enigmatic Mr. Darcy. But she is suffering from problems which get in the way. She is prideful and she's prejudiced against the things she believes about Mr. Darcy, who is rather aloof and prideful himself, and who doesn't seem to be the kind of charming, sensitive man that she would like to be with. And so a number of other men pass through her life, and one after another she finds that actually they aren't suitable for marriage. Her sisters are going through similar experiences, and they show us in what ways women perhaps become unsuitable themselves for marriage. Maybe like one of Elizabeth's sisters, she is far too serious and takes herself far too seriously to ever find a good wife. Maybe she's too flighty and she's going to end up with the wrong man. Or maybe she's very, very beautiful, but frankly, not very clever. And she ends up with a very rich but rather dull husband. Whereas Elizabeth Bennet manages to chart her way through the middle of these various balancing acts. And she finds in Mr. Darcy ultimately the perfect husband and the perfect house as well, the stately manner that she inherits as becoming Mr. Darcy's wife. And this is an interesting way to look at Pride and Prejudice. There's a huge amount you can say about that novel. It's wonderfully written by Jane Austen. But because we're fascinated as humans by change, and because we're always charting the kinds of changes that go on about us, we watch and read the details of this story that's being laid out for us with incredible attention. And because Jane Austen is a very astute social commentator, she can take us really into the details and the nitty-gritty of how these changes happen. Wonderful storytelling, all based around the changes that lead from a young single life to a mature adult married life. Spider-Man, one of my favorite stories since I was a very young boy myself. I read in the comic books. Why is Spider-Man fascinating? Is it because he can shoot webs from his hands? Is it because he can climb buildings? Is it because of his red and blue costume? No, it's because in a more modern way than Jack and the Beanstalk, Peter Parker, who becomes Spider-Man after being bitten by a radioactive spider, and then has to deal with the great powers and responsibilities that come with them, is a more modern kind of example. He's an adolescent who struggles with feelings of being an outcast, feelings of not fitting the masculine model of the day that he lives in. But instead he finds a different kind of masculinity that he can fulfill, becomes a different kind of man, granted superpowered and super strong. but it's a more modern telling of that transition from young man to responsible adult. King Lear, one of the classic plays of all time, written by William Shakespeare. King Lear looks at the other end of life. How do we, after having had a full life where we have become powerful and rich and a king and the pinnacle of society, what happens when we lose all that, or when we try to let all of that go? And with it go all of our relationships with our family, with our daughters. King Lear, during the course of the play, loses everything, and he descends into madness and faces death itself, accompanied all the while by a fool who's commenting on the absurdities of King Lear's behavior and the choices that he makes, which is all of William Shakespeare's ways of commenting on this massive change, the end of life, the decline of life. And this is why King Lear has lasted and been produced year upon year for almost 400 years now. And it's all because of this basic element of storytelling, the basic element of the rhetoric of story, change. These stories tell us about important changes in human life. Whilst as humans, we are fascinated by change, and we're continually trying to understand all the thousands or millions of kinds of change that are going on around us any given time, and telling stories about those changes, we're also a bit terrified of change. With change comes the unknown. We never know what's going to happen on the other side, particularly of a major life change. When you go away to university, when you start a new job, when you get ill and face the possibilities of all the changes that come along with that. These are terrifying experiences. They can be adventurous and challenging, but we always feel a sense of fear about them as well. Change is scary. Change means letting go of things. It means letting go of the people that we know, our ideas of who we are, what job we have. Maybe we're going to head off in a brand new direction in life. Maybe we're emigrating to another country, and everything that we had in this country is going to be left behind. It's scary. You know, change is difficult and tough and challenging. So very often, when we sit down to be entertained by stories, whilst they're fundamentally about change, they also deny change. And this brings in an idea that's very important in storytelling, which is the idea of equilibrium. That the story will be about a major change in life, but at the end of the story, the situation before the change is restored. And this happens all the time in comedies, because we go in and we want to laugh. Think about an episode of Friends, or really almost any American situation comedy you can think of. What happens in a typical episode of Friends? Well, the 6 characters gather together in their lovely New York apartments, and they face a problem. Something's come up. There's going to be some kind of change happening in their lives. Maybe Chandler has quit his job. Rachel's been fired from the coffee shop. We want to know, will Ross and Rachel get together? But we do eventually find out, the very end of like 7 seasons of Friends. But within each individual episode, whatever is brought up, whichever problem comes up, it's resolved by the end of the episode. And we finish back with the same 6 characters. They haven't really got any older. Nothing bad has happened to them. Nobody has died. This isn't King Lear that we're watching. And much of the humor, and in fact the comfort of a lot of storytelling, it's about the restitution of equilibrium, particularly in comedy, but you find it in all kinds of popular storytelling, because very often people don't want to deal with these big life changes just when they're being entertained. So when you find in a story that change gives way instead to restitution of equilibrium, because of this basic fear of change. When we're thinking about change in storytelling, there are tiers of change. There are ways that change happens and they affect people in different manners. Big, boisterous adventure stories, action movie, kids' comics, they're very often about physical change in the outer world. A war story is about the Allies versus the Nazis, and the Allies defeat the Nazis, and the world is kept as a democracy, as it truly should be, depending upon your politics. Obviously, if you were reading in Nazi Germany, that would have a different ending. But this is a big physical change in the outer world. An action movie like Die Hard is about defeating the terrorists who've taken over Nakatomi Tower. Also about a couple of other things, which we'll come back to. You have social change, as we were considering in Pride and Prejudice, and this is an area that stage plays and good literary fiction often deal with. And this is about how the relationships between people shift and alter over time. So how a daughter growing up in a family home will age and develop new relationships with her parents, who will have to go from being mother and father to becoming friends in her life, and how she forms new relationships with people in the rest of the world. And these social relationships are really compelling, and they're in most kinds of storytelling. And then you get down to the internal level of change. And this is often the most difficult to observe. But if you look at really, really powerful storytelling, it usually revolves around what's happening inside us as people and how we change internally over time in ways that we actually find very, very difficult to express. And we often turn to the art of the storyteller to express for us what these changes are. One of my favorite novelists, Haruki Murakami, is a real master of the internal change. In Norwegian Wood, the external changes, the physical changes in the world are very limited. The world is much as we find it as the beginning of the story. The social changes are very limited as well. But the internal change, as we follow the story of a young man who's 21, when we meet him at the beginning of the tale, he ages a few years. The internal changes that he goes through of experiences of isolation, loneliness, grief, loss. These are really powerfully explored, and these are, for me, these are the most important things that storytelling can take us into, and they're the most difficult things as well. So when we start to consider the stories that we're writing, this level of internal change, how it relates to social change and physical change beyond it, are really important. And you can chart out epic, magnificent tales just by considering those different tiers of change. One thing that you see very, very often, in fact, I would argue in all stories, is that they're always really telling at least two stories. That's the small story of the character at the center of the drama, and the big story going on around them. These two stories always interrelate. Earlier on I mentioned Die Hard. Detective John McClane, played by Bruce Willis, and he's on a mission for most of the movie to stop the terrorists who have taken over the Nakatomi Tower. And if you're going to look at it, you could say, well, Die Hard is a story about defeating terrorists. But that's not why we find Die Hard compelling. There have been hundreds of trashy, straight-to-video movies made about defeating terrorists, most of them with Chuck Norris in. But the Bruce Willis version is better. And we watch it over and over again, and decades after it was made. It's actually a classic of cinema. Why is that? Well, it's because around the big outer story, there's a smaller inner story. And the inner story is much simpler. It's about how a man gets his lost love back and reunites with his divorced wife, and also later on the rest of his family and the Die Hard sequels. Because the filmmakers know this, they understand that what's really compelling, even if we're turning up to the cinema to watch gunfights and explosions and the defeat of terrorism by a lone hero and gunslinger, what's actually really powerful and important in that story is the much more internal tale of Detective John McClane getting his wife back. And this begins in the very first frame and beat of the movie. We understand that John McClane's character is isolated, who's cut off from what should be the most important things in any man's life, which are his family. And that even while we're watching all the gunfights and explosions of Die Hard, we're actually following the details of how a relationship is rebuilt through the metaphor of an action story. And this is wonderful, because in any kind of storytelling, however grand and boisterous, however quiet and small and internal, we actually have these two stories running side by side. The big story, the small story. The big story is generally of the outer world. The small story is of the character and how they change at the center of all of this. Again, we come back to the idea of change as the most important part, really, of our 7 elements of storytelling and the rhetoric of story. In the early parts of any story, the opening scene, the first sentences and paragraphs, we tip the reader off, we prime the reader so that they can begin to guess and then understand what the story is about and what change the story is exploring. So in Pride and Prejudice, the classic opening sentence, any man with a fortune must be in want of a wife, which I paraphrase slightly. We're being told that this is a story about marriage. It's a socially focused story about how we find a good marriage and how young women develop in their lives. And these are very important values today that Jane Austen is writing. And so very quickly, the audience are keyed into the fact that this story is going to be for them, or not for them, possibly. And the opening shots of Die Hard, Detective John McClane is on board a plane. He's carrying gifts, the kind of gifts that a divorced father buys for his children, extravagant, overblown gifts. And even though we don't know absolutely, because the human mind, we all as people are very astute observers of the society around us, we start to pick up on these clues of what the change is going to be. And it's enjoyable for us to put these pieces together. But once we've primed our audience, once we have defined what the meaning of the story is, what change we're thinking about, it's very important as storytellers that we stick to that and that we don't go leaping around for all other kinds of other changes. No matter how complex and apparently epic and enormous the story we're telling, it really will only ever be about one change at any given time. So if we take Game of Thrones, the epic, huge fantasy novel series by George R.R. Martin, now a tremendously successful television show on HBO. This is enormous. It's been through 5, now 6 seasons of television. There are 6 enormous volumes of the book, but there's only really one outer change being explored in Game of Thrones, and that is the change of power. Who is going to win the titular Game of Thrones? And all of the characters that we follow are involved in one way or another with this epic power struggle. And from the opening scenes all the way through chapter after chapter of this story, it's the fact that it's coherent and it has a unity around one form of change that we keep coming back for. Whereas if George R.R. Martin had gone leaping around through different kinds of change each time he switched character, the story would be much, much less compelling to us. So this unity of change and unity of storytelling, really, really important. Another very important thing to consider. There's also another change, of course, happening within Game of Thrones, and that's each of the individual characters. We have 5, 6, half a dozen individual, really powerful archetypal transitions. Jon Snow going from young boy to great hero. Arya starting as a young girl, and she's becoming what we think will be an assassin. Sansa, who's becoming, through great suffering and travails, the ultimate archetypal queen figure, like Queen Elizabeth, right down to the red hair. And we also recognize these archetypal inner changes, and they all relate to the outer change, the power struggle. They continue to be unified because the relationship between these changes is really strong and powerful. So even if you're talking about more than one kind of a change at a time, you want to try and keep this unity very strong in your storytelling, because as soon as you lose it, as soon as you stray from the path that you've primed your reader on, the audience drift away because they come expecting something and you start giving them something else. With this idea of change, of course, comes the idea of meaning. Very often writers today were a little bit afraid, a little bit phobic of the idea of meaning. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If we go into our work trying to convey a very specific and narrow, and particularly a political meaning, it can become very didactic very quickly. But what we really turn to for story is to look at the great changes of life, how they affect us on the physical or the social plane, or critically, how we change internally over time, and to give some kind of meaning to these ideas. So if we go all the way back to the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, we're exploring the idea of change. We're exploring how a young man becomes a mature adult in society. You could tell this story about a young woman as well, just as easily. And what we really want is not just a guide to the change, but an idea of how this change is meaningful. So at the beginning of the story, Jack's life is kind of meaningless because of his laziness. And at the heart of Jack and the Beanstalk is the idea that adult life has meaning, has value, and that we can enter it and we can become valuable members of society. In more modern storytelling, in the modern novel, art house cinema, for instance, these meanings might be much more complex. We might question the value of adult life. We might consider ideas, as Haruki Murakami does, of being isolated or alone in life. But this, in its way, is its own form of meaning that we turn to as adults living complex modern life, because we need that kind of meaning in our lives. So when we talk about change, we're also talking fundamentally about our need for meaning, and what we turn to in the best storytellers, and what we're trying to achieve as storytellers ourselves, is the exploration of change and finding profound and important meaning within that change. A question that I'm going to leave you with for this lecture, thinking about your own storytelling, the stories that you're working on in your imagination, that you're writing, that you're developing scripts for, that you're working on as movies, that you're taking into other areas of life. What is the change at the heart of your story? It might be difficult to describe it in a single sentence to answer that question in any way simpler than the story itself, but it's worth considering. What's the change at the heart of your story, and perhaps what's the meaning that you're giving to your audience by exploring that change? Thank you very much again for joining me for the Rhetoric of Story. We've been exploring the first part of that rhetoric, number 1 in the 7 elements of basic storytelling, the idea of change. I hope you'll join me again for the next lecture. Thank you very much.